In the previous video, I modified this component. I'm now going to continue working in the forward superstructure, building upwards. I'm going to jump past these recommendations for now and focus on these two. That mostly focuses on the modification of this part. These openings for the ladderways need to be moved forward to this area, and this entire platform actually needs to be dropped slightly. It says here that it was elevated 2 feet above the forebridge at a point just after the compass platform. Admittedly, there isn't a lot of information here, so I went and had a look at the 3D model of HMS Hood in World of Warships, and that clarified things quite nicely for me. As you can see, this platform needs to be lowered down, roughly to the same height as these wings that stick out over there. To see how that looks with these components, I need to assemble them. When I put this component on, you can see that this floor over here is the same height as the top of these, which means that what I need to do is just cut these holes out and then make that the floor. Of course, that means that these tubes also need to be removed because that's still going to be part of the floor, and this area needs to be opened up for the ladder to be able to be inserted down the sides over here. While I have these components assembled, I'll show you another little problem with this area of the ship. The molding of this component isn't very good. There's a small gap over here due to the step at this aft portion of this ledge. That then is translated upwards to this area over here, where there's a gap introduced between this component and that component. What that means is I need to remove this step so that it is all the same height as that over there, and in doing so that will remove that gap as well, since these two parts will then be able to sit on top of each other properly. And that is where I will start. This is a job for the bar file. All of this plastic aft of this step needs to be removed and smoothed out. I wonder what they did to the mold to get it this far out of alignment. It is quite a substantial step, and it's consistent across this entire back section of the part. At least it is relatively easy to fix. The biggest concern is just knowing how much of the plastic to remove. So I file a bit and then place all the components together to do a test fit and see how big that gap is. I have to do this a number of times just to make sure that I get it to the right height without taking away too much plastic. It can also be a bit difficult to keep it all level, but I'm not too concerned about that. If I do take off too much, then I can easily refill the gaps with plastic putty. The gap between these components is going to have to be filled anyway, so it doesn't really matter if I take away a little bit too much in an area. Regardless, it's best to get it right the first time, if that is possible. Now that I've fixed that little problem, I can move on to the modifications for these parts. The first thing I'm going to do is remove these cylinders. All they are points to help align these parts with each other. Does mean I'll just have to do it by hand and be a little bit more careful, but that's not really going to matter much. So I clip them off and file down the area as best as I can. Next, I want to open up this section of deck. I'll start by drilling a hole in the center of these platforms, and then use a hobby knife to scrape out plastic to widen the hole. As with opening up the triangular section in the platform below this one, I take it slowly to make sure that I don't have to do any corrections at a later point. I'm most concerned about using too much pressure and then snapping this section of splinter shield that's floating now. I would prefer to not have to repair that at a later point. Before I move on to the next side, I'm going to do a test fit. It's looking quite good. I think this is going to be successful, but it is a bit rough, so I need to finish it off with some filing first. And I think this side can also be opened up a little bit more to help it align better with the internal bulkheads of the structure. That, I think, is all pretty good, so I can move on to the other side, and I follow the exact same process and get the exact same result. Next, I'm going to open up the ladderways. This bulkhead needs to be removed, and a section of this platform also needs to be removed. This is going to be a bit more tricky since this is thicker plastic and I'm working in quite a constrained space. After making a few cuts into the plastic with a hobby knife, I'm able to gouge them out and then smooth out the area a little bit using a file. I repeatedly do test fits with the piece that goes above this one just to make sure that the gap is in alignment. Now that I'm relatively happy with the position of these openings, I can start working on taking out this section of deck. Once again, I'll start by drilling a few holes into this area of the ship to just open it up so I can more easily get a blade into the area. This is so far the most complicated part of this modification. This plastic is quite thick, the area is very constrained, I'm trying not to damage the components around it, and in the end I need to end up with an opening that actually looks good. I'm definitely noticing that I am scuffing up the deck quite a lot, and it's quite difficult for me to keep the openings the same size and shape, so I'm going to have to come up with a plan to resolve that. But it's just a matter of whittling away at it, using a blade to cut out little pieces of plastic and try and file it out and hook it out and gouge out bits and pieces here and there. This is not very enjoyable work, in my opinion, but it's something that needs to be done, so I'll do it. After a long time, a lot longer than I think I'm going to admit, I get into a state that I am okay with, but as you can see, the openings are not of the same size and shape, so it's not good enough. I'm going to have to do a repair to that. I think the easiest thing to do is to rebuild the floor, and I can do that quite easily with a piece of thin styrene stock. I just need to cut it to the same shape as the floor. That's not too difficult. It's effectively a trapezoid, I think. Anyways, it's not difficult to cut. It does take a little bit of trial and error to get it to be the correct size so that it fits in nicely. But once that's done, I now have a section of platform that I can easily remove and more precisely cut openings into that I can then place on top of the somewhat messed up deck below. This means that I can open up these holes a little bit more, make them a little bit wider, since I know that the top will cover them nicely. Cutting out these gaps is so much easier on a flat piece of plastic like this, a nice thin piece of plastic as well. Take a little bit more time to make sure that the openings are the same depth and the same width, and in the end I'm quite happy with the result. This piece of plastic is almost ready to be glued in place. I do just want to do a few more checks on it first with the photo etch ladders, just to make sure that everything is going to go into this area correctly. Obviously, if these holes need to be a bit deeper, or if there's some other problem with them, I'd like to make those corrections before I glue this part down. While we are talking about photo etch, let me just look to see where other pieces of photo etch will go. As you can see, this platform that sticks out of the back here will be replaced with photo etch, so that can be cut off and filed smooth. Then I'm also going to remove this landing for the photo etch ladder that's going to go through these openings. I don't think these holes need to be made smaller, so I'll just cut it off and file it smooth. And then I need to look at the upper platform. Here you can see that these two ladders need to be removed and placed into these locations. Those will then be filled. So those two photo etch ladders can be used here. That's part B16. I'm just going to cut off one for now because this is just a test fit. I don't actually need both of them folded at this stage. Even though this is a very small part, I like to use the photo etch folding tool for folding ladders. I found that the photo etch folding tool helps to keep the posts of the ladder in alignment and prevents you from accidentally damaging the rungs. Once it is folded, there's a little more strength to the part, and then it's easier to hold in your fingers and then use a blade to push out the individual rungs. Obviously, this ladder was intended to go all the way up to the deck above, so we know it is going to be long. What I'm more concerned about at this stage is making sure that it is able to fit through this hole. And as you can see, it fits in very well. So I think this is a good position for these openings. So I'm happy to go ahead with gluing down this piece of deck. Installing this new surface for the deck is very simple. It's just a matter of holding it down and using extra thin plastic cement to bond it in place. While I'm working in this area, I need to close up these sections. This should be a bulkhead. Obviously it was exposed when I removed the deck above it. That is incorrect. This should be the bulkhead to the forebridge or the compass platform. I'm not exactly sure as to what this room is called. I think this is the compass platform. Anyways, I fill these gaps using plastic stock that I glue down using Revell Contactor Professional. Next, I'm going to deal with these ladderways. I need to cut off these blocks and then prepare this area of the ship for a repair. These are the incorrect locations for the ladderways. To fill these gaps, I place masking tape over the openings on the side that I want to have the smooth finish on. I then flip over the part, and into the openings I drop sections of plastic stock that I've cut roughly to the correct size, and I then flood the area with extra thick superglue. This thick layer of superglue is going to take some time to dry, so I leave it for a few hours to cure. Once it's cured, I can remove the tape, and I expose a pretty good surface on the top of the part, but it's not perfect, and there are some divots that need to be filled with putty, so I apply a thin layer of putty, which I'll then file and sand off at a later stage. Since I now have the putty out, I will work with that putty in a number of other areas. For these openings, it will mostly be concealed by the ladder, and also it's going to be very difficult to look into this area of the ship, so having a perfect finish isn't really necessary, but I would like it to be, good, or as good as I can get it without going overboard. So I'm going to fill these gaps with plastic putty and try and create a smooth finish. This area at the top of the platform is also going to have to be filled with putty, but there's going to have to be a further round of sanding and filling when the upper section gets attached to this part. And there will also be a door in this area, so it doesn't need to be perfect because it will be concealed with photo etch. I'm putting on quite a lot of putty here just to bulk up the area and make it a little bit stronger. Now that the putty has dried, it can be filed off. Almost all of this putty is going to be removed. It only really needs to be a very, very thin layer to fill a few divots on the surface. So I file most of it off and then sand it. That then opens up this area and allows me to start installing some additional plastic stock to bulk up the size of this structure. Following the advice of the HMS Hood Association, we know that this section is too narrow and it needs to be the same width as the section forward of it. This is quite easy to fix. I'll just cut out sections of styrene stock and glue it to the surface until it's the correct width. Having said that, if I didn't have a chopper, this would be significantly more difficult. It took a little bit of trial and error to find the correct width for cutting these sections of styrene stock, but once I had it set up in the chopper, cutting out multiple pieces of the exact same width was trivial. All of these sections of styrene stock were glued down using extra thin plastic cement. As good as the chopper was at getting all of these parts the same length, the end is not perfect. You can see the gaps between the individual sections of styrene, so I fill those gaps using a thin layer of plastic putty. The putty on the other component has been drying for a while, but it's still a long way from being fully dry. It really needs to dry overnight for that. But it is now stiff enough for me to manipulate it with a brush wet with lacquer thinners. Lacquer thinners is the solvent for this putty. Using a brush wet with lacquer thinners to help shape the putty will make things a bit easier for me. It is easier to do it this way rather than waiting for it to fully dry and then trying to file it smooth with a file or sandpaper. The issue with this method is that you won't get as good a finish as with a file or sandpaper. But as I previously said, this is going to be a very difficult area of the ship to see into. So as long as the finish is reasonably good, I think I'll be okay with it. After leaving the putty to dry overnight, I did some light filing and sanding to help improve the overall shape and finish of these components. I then sprayed them with Mr. Surfacer 500. Mr. Surfacer will fill micro scratches and also reveal any defects in the modifications that I've made. But for a change, I think this actually looks really good first time round. And surprisingly, there isn't actually any more corrections that I need to do at this stage. Which means this is a good time to end this video. In the next video, I'll be showing you something different. Today a delivery arrived for the HMS Hood, and we'll be taking a look at that. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.